is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Migration has always been a part of human history, but the issue of African migrants is one that has been both controversial and rather misunderstood around the world. Now, contrary to what many believe, in 2017, African migrants accounted for only 14% of the global migrants population, and 70% of African migrants remained within the continent. Well, this week, as Africa's leaders gather in Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire to discuss Africa's youth, jobs and migration for the Mo Ibrahim Governance Weekend, we take a critical look at how improving African governance will have a bearing on Africa's migrants. I'm Beatrice Marshall from Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire. Welcome to this special edition of Talk Africa.
According to the 2019 Mo Ibrahim report on youth and migration, in 2017, the total number of migrants in Africa was just over 36 million. This was much lower than in Asia and Europe, where the numbers stood at 106 and 62 million respectively. Migrants leave their homes for entirely different reasons, but 80% of African migrants are driven by the search for much better economic opportunities. Only around 20% of African migrants are refugees who leave due to insecurity. According to the same report, of the 80% of African migrants who are seeking a better life, the majority are young people. This is due in part to Africa's growing youth population and a lack of economic opportunities. Around 60% of Africa's population is currently less than 25 years old, while 18 million new jobs are needed annually just to absorb new entrants to the labor market. Only 3 million new jobs are being created at the moment.
Well, let's unpack this question of migration and good governance in Africa. I'm now joined to discuss this further by Abdoulie Janneh. He's the Executive Director of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. I'm also joined by Madam Aïcha Diallo. She's a former Minister of Education of Guinea, where she pioneered work on lowering barriers to education for girls. I'm also joined by Dr. Abdallah Hamdok. He's a former Deputy Executive Secretary and Chief Economist of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. He's also the Chairperson of the Technical Committee of the High Level on Illicit Financial Flows from Africa. That's been a very contentious issue on the continent. But let's talk about governance and immigration issues. I'll start off with you, Abdullah Janneh, because we're looking at this new statistics that have just been released by the report on jobs and migration 2019, and we're looking at the new development, or rather not really a new development, that 14% of the global migration population is actually the Africans, significantly less than those from Asia, which account for 41%, or Europe, which accounts for 24%. More importantly, more than 70% of the migration from sub-Saharan Africa is across the continent. This is a new phenomenon, but why does it always look like that the central focus of migration is Africa, and in a very negative way?
Well, that's precisely why, in fact, we have our forum to really unpack this issue, to say what are the facts. You know, Africa is not invading, Europe or anywhere. There's not a mass exodus of Africa to these countries. The bulk, as you say, there's a movement within Africa, which we should salute, in fact, encourage and just manage. This is a free movement of people. It will bring Africans together. The other less number of who are going, it's just sensational. You know, they see people capsizing boats, which is regrettable. There is no doubt about that. But they are really using it to paint a picture of mass exodus of Africans. It's raising security concerns in the countries where they are supposed to go. They feel there will be a strain on their services and so on, which is far from the truth. These are people, if at all they in fact allow them in, this sometimes well-educated people who would work, who would contribute to GDP in those countries, and so it is not a mass exodus. Let's put it in summarizing it. It's not a mass exodus of Africa to Europe or any other country.
Right, Madam Diallo, 60% though of Africa's population is largely made up of the youth. So most of the migrants, whether it is across the shores to Europe or across the continent, are really possibly young people. This is still a concern though, or not?
It is a big concern. And this 60% of the population is, their age is less than 25 years, okay? And they are highly educated. And if they stay in our countries, they will be contributing to the development of the countries. So moving within Africa is a blessing. Now going to Europe is another problem because they are going expecting to get jobs, which they will not. And the media has shown these people dying in the sea. And when they are captured, they are put into camps and then sent back to their own countries. Or they die in the desert, dans le désert. And this is really terrible. When I see it, I cannot sleep. Because we know that to develop a country, we need these human resources. And the countries are losing their future by not giving them the opportunity to get jobs or be able to set their own enterprises.
Dr. Hamdok, what are your thoughts?
I fully agree with my sister and brother here. This migration narrative is totally distorted narrative. If you look at the figures, as you rightly put it, a very small fraction of the Africans. In fact, when you look at the percentage globally, even if you look at it, the number of migrants from Africa to Europe and compared to the numbers within the continent is a small fraction. I think this is essentially a European problem, trying to probably push it somewhere else to think that the problems of political issues and challenges within Europe is an African problem. It's totally false. What is required here, I think, is to get the facts right, to engage our European brothers and sisters and partners in getting the facts right, and maybe also in coming up with a framework that would allow us to reach a win-win situation that would help those countries and also help us.
And that is the question that I'll put to all of you. How do you change that narrative, though? Because for years now, it has been African migrants on boats going to Europe. Nobody really talks about the migration that is on the continent. Are you going to change that narrative?
Let us get credible facts. Let us do this and let us disseminate these facts. Let us have sessions on them like the forum. The forum here, we have maybe 1,000 people who came. I mean, and so all of them, Africans, non-Africans, will really go out with a better understanding of what these challenges, how much of it is an African issue rather than a European issue. And I think also the media has a role to play in this. I think the media should be better informed and remove this sensational aspect of reporting on migration. I think we should report anytime you have a boat that goes down and we have young people drowning and so on. There's no doubt about that. That should be done. But we should always put this in context. And I think we are losing that. So let's all work together, really build a coalition that would inform each other, that would get the media on our sides. Let's get the dialogue between us and our partners, particularly our non-African partners, particularly European partners, because they're the ones who feel that Africa is invading them. And I think we should get to them, we should discuss, and every time we discuss, I think we should give it wide-scale diffusion to say this is the situation.
So, yes, Dr. Hamdok.
Yes, I think, you see, what is missing in this discourse is treating migration as a development issue. In Africa, we should have a development or a framework or a perspective that is essentially developmental in nature, which would allow us to have a discussion that will look at migration as a positive issue. Partly because migration, if you look at it, there is source, transit, and destination. how can we create a win-win situation in the three areas? Migration can be an extremely positive force in the three areas. The contribution of the migrants in the destination, contribution back to the origin, and also in the transit area. But our partners, particularly from Europe, as Abdullah was saying, they should sit with us and look at it. When you come up with a developmental perspective, you treat development aid and all this, rather than counting the figures that goes to supporting migrants in the destination, come help us develop this continent. Retain, this is our future. We're not losing the history. We're losing the future. This is the well-educated, taxpayers' money went into them. The migrants are the best of our talent.
Madam Diallo.
2 days ago, we had a meeting of Europeans and Africans, and we discussed the issue. And we said that what is important is to have the legal migration fixed. And also we said that it's a win-win process, as we said, and it will be important to allow a policy being developed between Europe and Africans, so that for students, for instance, they will have Erasmus, bringing Europeans to come to our universities, and also our students to go to Europe, so that we will learn from each other and get to know each other better. It's a win-win process, because when Africans move to Europe, for instance, they do contribute to the GDP of the country.
South Africa, Cote d'Ivoire, Uganda are the countries that are listed as having taken in the largest number of migrants on the continent, though. But we are seeing, Dr. Hamdok, we are seeing South Africa, for instance, suffering from xenophobic attacks. How do you make it sustainable on the continent?
Well, I think in terms of frameworks, the fact that the continent has progressed so well in terms of the building blocks of the RECs, the regional economic communities, ECOWAS people moving within this region freely, they don't need visa. It is very much in East Africa community, in SADC. What is left is to put this newly approved continental free trade area into implementation. I think it's a huge milestone that the Africans have achieved that. Still, of course, the devil is in the details, but also in the implementation. We're very good in the continent at producing fantastic frameworks, resolutions, and pacts and all that. We need to move the extra step in implementing this. And I think South Africa is a country that needs to get to terms with this internally. They need to have that discourse within South Africa itself. The whole continent worked and supported in an extreme form of solidarity with South Africa that allowed us collectively to defeat apartheid. The rest of the continent cannot be paid back by having this xenophobic reaction in South Africa. It's a political leadership issue. South Africa needs to confront it. The idea that there are 6 million, 8 million, 600 million Africans packing their bags and ready to move into South Africa, it's a false pretension. Let us just drop this. They need, it's a leadership issue. ANC, whoever in the leadership of the country, they need to act on this.
Very interesting insights indeed. We'll continue with this discussion in a moment. For now, we'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll look at the solutions to migration in Africa. Stay tuned.
Nigeria now for a look at some economic data out of the country.
With a dedicated and diverse team of anchors, CGTN now brings Africa to the palm of your hand.
I'm Firina Karibe in the heart of Nairobi, which is bustling.
From everyday heroes to the continent's most powerful figures, we bring their voices to you.
We haven't changed.
And this is something most of us are very excited about.
We bring you news that's changing perspectives. News that brings Africa to the world. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Our conversation on migration in Africa continues. Still with me, my expert panel of guests, Dr. Abdallah Hamdok, Madam Aïcha Diallo, and Abdoulie Janneh. African leaders are saying that they do want a permanent solution to the immigration problem, whether it is positively on the continent or negatively across the shores into through the Mediterranean. What is the dilemma, though, of African leaders when it comes to finding a permanent solution?
The majority of migrants intra-African is within. We have to manage that. For example, I think the best way for Africa to integrate, one of the critical issues, is the free movement of people. But now, this is difficult. You need visas to go to 53 different African countries and so on. So if they should encourage this movement, it is positive. This is one of the best ways that this continent can come together and develop further. So they should, as I say, one critical thing is visa, the problems of visas. They should do that. Rwanda, Mauritius, Ghana, they have abolished visas. Are they being invaded? No, they are not being invaded. So make it legal. Make it, if it will not be clandestine, let them move in and let's encourage it. And take this country, for example. They have 6 million refugees. They have 6 million migrants in this country. Yeah? This is a significant, 25% of their population. But they have managed it very well.
So let's look at one of the challenges, though, that has seen the rise in migration, whether it is across the continent or across the sea. So, and we are looking at Africa's economic prospect here. It has been very good over the last 10 years, on average 4 to 5% economic growth rate, but that doesn't seem to have trickled to the population. And we are told that the majority of those who are moving around the continent are young people seeking employment. Is it that our governments, our leaders are not ambitious enough to make the trickle-down effect happen?
Well, you know, the return of the growth to the continent in this century is a very much welcome development. The 80s and the 90s, we consider them as a lost decade. Africa was growing at a negative growth rate. But from the dawn of this century, the return of the growth came back. Some of the countries actually are growing at double digits. You're absolutely right. This growth has very little impact on poverty, on unemployment. It might have even fueled an increase in inequality. Question becomes, in what type of quality of growth that we need to put in place so that we will be able to address poverty and unemployment, particularly among the youth. And this is where we need the quality jobs that is created through industrialization, through value addition, and we are very much placed in going in that direction. There are a lot of frameworks in this respect. The fact that the long-term development planning return also to the continent, the fact that the African Union approved the 2063 agenda, which is in conformity and talks so well to the global agenda on sustainable development 2030. What is required also is to transform that at national level into long-term development plans that will take into consideration the priorities of the nation, which is essentially creating jobs, and that will go a long way in addressing issues of our young talent going somewhere else.
Yes, go ahead, Madam Diallo, because you are also championing the girl rights.
The problem is the kind of skills which the market needs, the kinds of skills the kids themselves need. That's where the problem is. Most of the young people are not being oriented towards technical or vocational, for instance, engineering. And yet these are the skills that the market needs. I think the day that the economic growth will be transformed into human development, all the problems will be solved. Quality education is key.
Mr. Janneh.
When we talk of economic management, when we talk of programs to ensure that we have growth, we should always ask ourselves the question, what is in this for the young people? I think is critical. And if we continue not to do that, if we continue to ignore the youth issue, it will tear the continent apart.
But the population is constantly outpacing the growth. How do you then create jobs for this rapidly growing population with such scarce resources?
That's also another issue. That's the whole issue of how we deal with population growth is an issue. But this is not something that can happen overnight. There's a question of culture, there's a question of religion, it's a question of education, and the role that the freedom that you give to women. It is also very important that really they have an equal voice in the family. So it is a multitude of factors that will add to that. But we are conscious of it now, and I think we should put in place policies that will enable us to be able to manage our population. But also the movement across the border is, if you take arable land, we have more arable land than any other part of the world. So if we facilitate this movement and you facilitate how we deal with agriculture, we have a global view of agriculture, it would help. So, but I quite agree with you that we must have population growth which does not outpace economic growth too much.
Dr. Hamdok.
I think this population issue, and particularly what you could call the youth bulge, this youth, it should be a dividend. It should not be a curse, provided that it is harnessed well and addressed well. There is a very short window of opportunity because nations that went before us have exploited this, but with a judicious, well-planned, systematic policies that address this. If you miss that window of opportunity, then this youth bulge becomes a curse. And it can fuel all kinds of tensions, whether it is civil wars, crime, and all that. The key to this is education. Absolutely, and human development factor is key. If you look at the recent developed countries, the Tigers, the Southeast Asian experience, and all that, it is essentially about human development, addressing issues of education, of health, and all that. They went through a very systematic, serious process of developing their human resources.
Madam Diallo.
Women and girls' education is the key to this demographic growth. When you educate women and especially girls, you will solve the problem of women empowerment. You will solve the question of gender equality. You will solve the question of even economic growth, because an educated woman will earn more than 15, voire 20% of growth. Then the whole quality of health for herself, maternal mortality, infant mortality, all this will be solved. The whole family will gain. Even environment preservation. When women have it, they are conscious of it, the whole country will be profiting. And peace, social cohesion, it's all about women and girls' education. That's why I have to fight for it.
It all ties down to governance, though, as well, if we want to move our economies forward. But there is a developing view, though, from certain quarters that perhaps it is time for Africa to change its model of development, perhaps putting development first before democracy. Your thoughts?
This is a very interesting debate, the sequencing, which come first. There is no hard and fast rule or an answer to this. It depends on the country's circumstances and situation. Historically, we know of experiences where countries developed so well and having democracy taken a backseat. So which route the country takes depends on the country's history, circumstances, culture, and all that. The countries will achieve this. The sequencing is left to the country how to achieve it.
So I want to get a final comment from all of you. And if you had to implement one vision for Africa to create employment for the youth, to sort the youth bulge, to stop economic migration and brain drain across the borders, but to also make migration on the continent more sustainable? What would that be?
I think it will have at least 2 or 3 levels. At the continental level, collectively, think together as Africans. We have always managed to get the best for ourselves and with the rest of the world when we are collectively thinking together, coming up with common African position in all this. Then for this to work, the test is to transform it into policies, practices, and action plans at the national level. If these two are able to talk to each other very well and implement it with commitment, with vision and all this, this continent has a great promise to be the best continent in the world.
Madam Diallo.
For me, it's peace and development at country level, then at sub-regional level, and then at the continental level. Before even going to the international level, start at home. Start, in fact, in your own family, community, nation, sub-region. But peace is what is going to help Africa develop. We need peace everywhere.
Mr. Janneh.
We should have sound macroeconomic policies because, you know, this continent needs investment, it needs them. That's the only way we would have the resources necessary. And third is really managing certain key sectors. For example, programs that manage key sectors. One is agriculture. We must give value addition to our agriculture, so that really we are not just exporting. But when we export, would be things with value addition. That I think that's key. Second, we must manage our natural resources so that really they benefit our individual countries, the continent, better. Third, we should deal with illicit financial flows because that gives us resources. We need resources. We need resources. So this is, if we do this, we will respond to the challenge of creating developmental states that will take into consideration the needs of the young people, give them hope, give them appropriate jobs, and help them meet their aspirations. I think if we do that, we're on the way to creating a very stable, meaningful continent that is responding to the needs of its citizens.
Thank you very much for your insights, Abdoulie, the Executive Director of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, Madam Aïcha Diallo, former Minister of Education of Guinea, and Dr. Abdallah Hamdok, former Deputy Executive Secretary and Chief Economist of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Thank you very much for such a wonderful discussion. Well, very insightful discussions indeed on Africa's migration patterns. Well, that's all we have time for this week on Talk Africa. But you can follow this conversation on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. And join us again next week for another edition of Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, in Abidjan, in Côte d'Ivoire, it's goodbye.